Hey, I'm just giving you an update. I started a new book because I suddenly realized that I would have to go to our hospital, and our hospital is like an hour away by bus. So I get horribly travel sick, and I cannot do anything but listen to an audiobook. So I searched Libby, which is always hard because it seems all that Libby has is romance books and romantasy and thrillers, but not good thrillers. But I eventually found one that is on my TBR list anyway. It's a non-fiction book called Keanu Reeves Does Not Love You, and it's about online romance and scams and things. So I've started listening to it, and I'll keep you updated.
You're so sweet like honey, baby.
Right, I finished, and it turns out Keanu Reeves does not love me. But no, just to talk about it. So Keanu Reeves Does Not Love You is a non-fiction book, obviously about online romance fraud, written by Becky Holmes, narrated by her, which felt quite nice because it felt like she was talking straight to me, and she was like this. She has this voice of like a middle-aged, cardigan-wearing, Chinsano drinking, spunky woman, I just found it very funny. The book itself is ridiculously funny in parts, but also very, very insightful and touching. I absolutely loved it. I would rate it 4.5 stars. It was 4 stars, but then when she was talking more towards the end of the book about some of the real impact of it, it kind of edged it up for me. Because it actually started to get a little bit repetitive for me, because it felt initially basically just to basically talk about how she started doing it. She was a woman, it was the pandemic time, she started scrolling through Tinder, and she would find lots of pictures of men holding dead trouts or being in a bathroom with the urinals behind them. For some reason, men don't do that. We don't want to see the trouts or the troughs, right? But she basically then got approached by lots of clear scammers, and she found that out quite quickly, and then she had a Twitter already, but she then started talking about this on Twitter, and her Twitter handle is Death to Spinach, and is so to this day, which is quite funny. But she essentially started talking about the interaction she was having with scammers. She realized there were scammers quite quickly, and she then, if you've not seen it, she did the same thing as James Beach did, who famously did a TEDx talk about how he scammed the scammers essentially, which, if you haven't seen it, is absolutely hilarious. I'm gonna link it below. And it was just incredible. It's so funny. And she basically started doing the same thing, and she would talk about the things she would say to scammers and stuff to scam them back, which was really funny. But it did start to get a little bit repetitive, and then I was kind of like, but then she luckily went into some other territory. But for example, at one point she said to a guy that she had no skin and she owned more aubergines than Judi Dench, and asked him to put vegetables up her bum. She would often get quite violent and tell them about how she was frequently murdering people. And she at one point gave a steam code as a recipe for steak and ale pie. So those were the types of moments where I was literally laughing out loud while walking around in public, which is my headphones in, and when a book makes me literally laugh out loud in public, I know it's very good. She wrote the Western Union as Western Onion, or they would ask for gift cards and she would put in the codes like scamming assholes or something the sort, and they would never ever really react to it, which is very interesting. Generally, I would say the writing is not smooth, but sometimes very witty and very funny, like the Trouts and Troughs thing. And there was actually one quote that made me laugh so much. Essentially, she was being approached by this pilot dude, and she said that when she saw his photo, she thought, many of us would have thought, Christ almighty, I would open my wing flaps and receive his landing gear. And that made me laugh out loud so much while I was running around. She also, obviously, she talked about Keanu Reeves and the fact that she had multiple people claim to be Keanu Reeves, and she would refer to, like, Keanu Reeves as to the fact that she had already spoken to him, and she'd be like, oh, you're back, where have you been? Sort of thing. And at one point she gave a code, and she put the instructions as follows: tap iTunes, enter Matrix, log in as John Wick, act with speed, peel off label at point break, and then have an excellent adventure. So like she does puns like this a lot, but she does give you lots of really interesting like tidbits. Like, for example, if a scammer asks for your photos, they might then use those photos to scam as you later on, if that makes sense. She obviously talks about celebrity scammers like Keanu Reeves. She talked to Brad Pitt, Liam Neeson. She at one point put them into a Google Hangout together, which was quite funny because then they were both like, "Don't talk to him, he's a scammer." And she says, you know, she initially thought that she was doing good by wasting their time because then they couldn't waste other people's time. But they do have so many women that she doesn't really have much impact. But I would actually say it's at least one person that they weren't scamming, probably while they were scamming her. She also talked to an actor called Mark Samet, which she mentioned, and I was like, I know him. Like, I don't know him, but I'm an actor in the UK, and I certainly have come across him and exchanged, like, messages with him and stuff, especially before he became more prominent, so that was very awkward. The interesting thing as well was that many of them come across her on Twitter, so they see her Twitter and the fact that she's clearly very aware of scammers, but they still approach her and they still try and scam her, which is very interesting. She relates a lot of stories because a lot of people come to her and relate their stories to her and talk to her about their experiences with scammers, and she will often talk about their stories as well as relating to her own story. She herself was never actually scammed, but she has had experiences obviously with scammers. She talks a lot about the fact that the victims of online romance fraud, but she actually doesn't like the word victim, are often kind of treated as vulnerable, and she doesn't like that way of speaking either. And she like doesn't like, she says at one point she looked at a story about online romance fraud that was in the media, of a woman that was a victim, and all like 700 comments that were underneath the story were just horrific, like, what a stupid cow, blah 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 blah. And she just feels like there's just such a lack of empathy for the victims of romance fraud, which is very strange because really it is. But yeah, so it's essentially kindness that makes people fall for the romance frauds and the manipulation, and the fact that people want to help other people who they feel are just falling on hard times. So it's really quite horrible the way we treat online romance fraud. And then, like I said, like the beginning of the book is very funny, very witty. Talks a lot about how she scams the scammers, but then she actually just go deeper into romance fraud and the fact that it's often linked to human trafficking, to cyber slaves who essentially are abducted and then have to be romance frauders to pay back the money, and like kind of work to defraud people to pay their debts, which is really, really horrible, and that like there's criminal gangs that engage in it. They write like proper manuals. Sometimes you think they'd be better at it, considering, because a lot of the fraud happens with people for whom English isn't their native language, but they pretend to be somebody English, like Keanu Reeves, and then you're like, are you though? So you think they'd be better if they had manuals, but alas. And she talks about how some of them, even once they are found out, then admit that it's actually them from Nigeria, and then they still continue a relationship with that victim because it just has gone so far. And for me, I love watching Catfish, right? So it was very interesting watching this, because Catfish and this had actually a lot of similar elements, right? And you would see like why people would like keep talking to somebody even after all the red flags were coming up and things like that. And she also talks about some of the stories where you literally are like, oh my god, she did everything right. You know, she like ran his images. He like, like she was being smart about it. And she talks a lot about how a lot of the women she talks to are very smart, very powerful, very capable women. And she actually, I should have said this at the beginning, she focuses in this exclusively on women. But this also happens to men, of course, but this book's exclusively focused on women. And yeah, basically how these criminal gangs just kind of victimize women. And it's quite horrible. And specifically, she talks about the Ghana Sakawa boys and the Nigerian Yahoo boys, which are essentially names for men from that area who engage in online romance fraud, because they're usually kind of told, if you do this, it's gonna be like so good, you're gonna get so much money, blah 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 blah. And the most interesting thing for me was that for both of those gangs, certainly for the Sakawa boys, it often also involves magical rituals, where they do proper magical rituals, weird things like running outside and barking like a dog, to basically make the women fall for them. More horribly, some of those magical rituals also involve human, not sacrifice, but basically body parts, and they are usually from human sacrifices. So she talks a lot about like, sort of the dark elements of these magical rituals. And interestingly, and this is something that actually the book doesn't touch upon at all, which I found a bit sad, and if it had, it might have gotten 5 stars from me. But one of the Yahoo boys, when he was found out, actually sent a message, quite an angry, quite a vile message, and it was certainly a vile message towards a victim. But he does talk about the fact that the UK colonized large parts of Africa, was drawing random borders in Africa, and then left Africa literally basically in poverty. And he says, and this is a direct quote, reap your dollars like you reap our crude oil. And that certainly was something that I felt about quite strongly. And while a lot of the higher ups in the criminal gangs, certainly, I mean, there's obviously cyber slaves, but the higher ups in the criminal gangs, some of the people performing romance fraud are very financially well off because of it and can buy designer items and blah blah blah. I think there is a certain element, and this is not explored in the book at all, and it would have been interesting, of revenge on the West for what they've done to Africa and for the way they've left Africa, and the fact that, a lot of African countries are left in a lot of poverty. And that was something that was really, really interesting to me, and something that I would have loved to have had explored a bit more and maybe seen from the other side. She only very much viewed it from the victim's side. To see it from the scammer side, like more about why they do what they do, because I do think that a lot of it is probably motivated by problems obtaining financial security, and things like that. And I think that's something that should certainly be investigated a lot more. But yeah, so this is a little bit about the Sakaba boys and the Yahoo boys. She also talks about how romance fraud and domestic abuse are actually a lot alike, and the like tactics employed by the employer, like the isolation, like the gaslighting, like the sort of manipulation and the love bombing and all of that. So it's very interesting, and she then talks a bit about her own domestic abuse that she herself experienced, sharing her own ugly story with us, and how the blame always lies with the woman, whether she's the victim or whether she's the one, scamming the man. It's always the woman who's the bad person, right? And how a lot of times women who do fall for romance frauds, and even probably the ones scamming, are then deemed to be like mentally ill or mentally not capable. And she talks about one of the stories where literally like a relative then was like, "You're clearly mentally not well," right? And she talks about this a lot, the shame, and how a lot of victims of romance fraud do not talk about it to their friends, to their family, certainly not to the police, and how it's probably incredibly underreported crime, because of attitudes like, "You're clearly mentally not well, you're not capable, how could you do that, you're so stupid, blah 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 blah," right? And that's kind of why it can be so prevalent, because we as a society shame people who become victims of it so horribly that people just don't feel like they can talk about it. So that's kind of very sad. Obviously, scammers go with advancements as well in technology. They become better, become more experienced. They now use AI to create like deep fakes, which is very interesting. Or they use things where they will pull videos but then like cut the sound off, or things like that. And she then talks like about the victims, aside from the direct victims, that come out of online romance fraud, which is obviously people like the cyber slaves, the people that might tragically lose their lives to those magical rituals, the human sacrifices, people whose identity has been stolen as well, who then sometimes they obviously get horrible abuse, being told like, "You stole my money, blah blah blah," and it wasn't even them. And then also family and friends of the victims, and not just because financially maybe the kids don't have the money, but also like, there's usually a massive, not financial impact obviously, but also emotional impact for the women that are victims, and that also ripples into friends and family. One of the most interesting statistics came at the end. 40% of crime is fraud, but only 1% of police time is spent investigating fraud, which is very interesting. Kind of makes you think, and I think it's because it's non-violent, so people always want the violent crime to be investigated more, right? But actually, like, we should look at this a lot more, and looking at like the people who are technically a support system, like action fraud, which are the people that basically the police will tell you to go to, where you fill in this lovely impersonal form and then send it and then never hear again, or get a very impersonal email back telling you that unfortunately they can't follow up because they've used AI to determine that they can't follow up. And I can certainly relate to that. At one point I had to speak to police because I was sexually assaulted, and the police response was horrible, shocking. No empathy, no nothing, very procedural. And I get there is procedure, but you could still throw in an "I'm so sorry that happened to you" or something, right? And that just doesn't exist. For action fraud, for the police, you're treated like a number, like a statistic, and it's not nice. And it's not that the police, like people in the police or people working for action fraud, don't want to do better, but it's like the structures prevent it. And she talks, because she talked to a lot of people in various places for the book, anonymous obviously, and they often say like nobody really knows what they're doing about online romance fraud, right? So, and then obviously the banks could be doing a lot more. And she actually talks about one story where a victim got all her money back because she went to the financial ombudsman and they ruled in her favor and said the bank should have totally stopped it. Which was very interesting. But yeah, banks could definitely, considering how often the bank will be like, this £200 payment, are you sure you want to be doing that? So they do that, but when you repeatedly send money abroad or through like Western Union or something, they don't have the capacity to go, are you sure you want to be doing that? And like asking you the right questions to identify, are you a victim of romance fraud? So, which a lot of victims would said, if they had done that, I probably would have said something. But yeah, that's the book. A final one in the acknowledgements. The thing she says is, first of all the people who have been assholes to me, fuck you, I've written a book. And I was like, I like you so much, Becky. But yes, I loved the book. It was very funny. It was very informative. Certainly made me view victims of online romance fraud differently. I certainly would have at some points been like, oh my god, how stupid are you? Like, did you not see it? Like, when I watch Catfish, I'm like, oh my god, why are you doing this? But I think I have much more empathy now, and I understand more now on how women and men can be tricked into believing those lies and manipulated and isolated and often caught at very vulnerable times when normally they wouldn't be caught out, but maybe they're dealing with something in their life that's making them more vulnerable to these sort of things happening. So yeah, I would certainly recommend. Let me know what you thought, and if you've read it or if you're interested in reading it now, or if you've been a victim and want to talk about it, or what you think about it. So yeah, just drop a comment below.